Okay, PPM number 37, written this date on March 21st, 2004, and going to be read on this date, March the 21st, 2014. 10 years ago, as I continue the commemoration of an experiment in which I wrote every day, every single day, what I'm calling a poetic phenomenological meditation, where I was exploring the question of the relationship between being, capital B, and learning, sometimes capital L, sometimes small l. In fact, if you want to get a sense of the distinction between the big L and the little l, you can go back into the blog where these are being posted and watch the dialogue between myself and Tyson Lewis, my colleague and friend, that happened last week when we were in Albuquerque, New Mexico for the Philosophy of Education Society meeting. So one of the reasons that dialogue happened was because I was exploring at that point in the meditations, at that point in the project, the discussion of the philosophy arising between friends, as a conversation between friends. In fact, Tyson is very interested in this. He talks about study as something that happens between friends. I just thought about this now, but given his understanding of study as something in which an experience in which we come face to face with our pure potentiality, I need to follow up with him on that, because I'm not sure how study happens between friends, and I'm sure he has an answer for it, and I think he has a chapter in his book on it, which I've glanced at and read parts of it very closely. I don't think certainly didn't read that part as closely as I should have. But at any rate, for me, it is actually an activation of our pure potentiality, closely connected to what Arendt calls the sheer activity of thinking. But something is actually happening and being made. So there isn't an object of study per se, or a question of study in dialogue, but the making of the very community that we find ourselves in. So the thing that's being made is friendship, and the thing that's being made is community. That's what's happening in learning together, and practicing philosophy. So philosophy makes friendship. Now, this is important. This is significant, right? Because so often people talk about the sort of essential role that love. Most often they talk about it as eros plays in philosophy. And most often it's talked about as the love of wisdom, or a love of an experience that a single person has. But we should also, and for me it's most significant to talk about love as a manifestation of human community. So when we are building human community, we're doing through friendship. As Arendt says, and I'm following that progression. First we have the conversation between friends, and from friendship emerges community. The community is what is the legacy, if you will, of friendship, or put differently, friendship is the foundation of community, right? So we can't talk of a state, of a nation state, being based on the foundation of friendship. It's based on something different, which is the rights, right? The codification of rights that apply to all equally in a democratic constitution. I don't know that there is any other kind, but in a democratic constitution, which is the structure, the legal framework for a nation state, the organizing principle of that is political rights, the rights of each citizen. So citizenry, which is the way we are vis-a-vis the state, emerges not from this ontological experience of friendship, but rather from the first and foremost, the codification of laws in the form of a constitution, and rights in the form of a constitution, and then the extension of those rights to everyone equally. So a state, a nation state, while important, and some, this is the ongoing argument since the 18th century, since political theory came about. One of the major arguments, questions and debates has to do with the purpose of the nation state. And, it's often thought that the purpose of the nation state is to protect us and to guarantee that we have these rights and to protect our freedoms. And then in protecting that, we're able to form communities. So community is what the state allows us to do, so to speak. It protects us from the intrusion of others, and it protects it from itself in a strange way, right? I mean, in a healthy state, there should be limited state control over what we do in our lives, particularly when it comes to how we congregate, be that in religious congregations or art congregations, any meaningful way that we get together that doesn't have to do with commerce. The state has sort of, has to stand back and protect our right to do that. And so, in some ways, that's the foundation of the American democratic state, is the protection of religious freedom. But I'm digressing. Why am I digressing so much? In part because the last place that I ended up was I made the statement, the sage's wandering cultivates a philosophy of the people. And that arose, that was a sort of big arc back to this conversation that started way back with Socrates. Last week I was in the middle of that, so it's not that far back, but it seems that way, where I was talking about this very point of philosophy and the cultivation of friendship. And then I dropped into this discussion of the sage, and in this discussion of the sage, I have now arrived back to this notion of how the sage, or the one who has sort of the capacity to lead the conversation, the capacity to initiate the conversation, how the sage is one who whose intent is to cultivate a philosophy of the people. So I picked that up from Heidegger, and I'm going to now pick it up on the meditation from this date, 3/21. Heidegger asks rhetorically, and perhaps even evocatively, who would deny that philosophy is a philosophy of a people? In raising this question, Heidegger is provoking sentiments we hold towards tribalism, nationalism, and so-called cultural philosophy, a philosophical discourse that is claimed to be the natural articulation of a people historically situated in a geopolitical region. Heidegger is offering to dismantle this perspective, and his question is an invitation to destroy the claims of Western philosophy as something great to which we can appeal. It is not the greatness that Heidegger is inviting us to deconstruct, but the habitual thinking that gives rise to such attributions as great Western philosophy. We are only capable of making such claims when we find ourselves to be domesticated within the self-enclosed habitat, the region with strict borders, and seemingly impassable fords. This type of region is not unlike the physical space of a walled city, with its guarded gateways and ramparts. If we never wander outside the guarded and walled city, we shall never encounter what is beyond, nor recognize the limits of the location. Moreover, we will fail to encounter our own domesticity. Domesticus, from domos, home, pertains to the home, something performed or made at home, but also the tame, not wild, and, quote, relating to the internal affairs of a nation, not foreign, made in one's own country, native grown, unquote. Domesticity, as a way of being, pertains to the life of comfort, or the concern for comfort, the maintenance of stability, certainty, security, predictability. To articulate a philosophy of a people can indicate the desire to practice domestic philosophy. Heidegger's challenge is to wander beyond the confines of the domestic habitat in order to discover another kind of abode, one that is impermanent yet offering shelter. This is an abode that is made and unmade every day, pitched nightly and unpitched at dawn. The philosophy that emerges in learning teaching does not belong to a people, to a nation, or a tribe. We can speak in this way, of course, but again, to do so is to speak within the language of domestic philosophy. The philosophy emerging from wandering does not pertain to a specific location. So it does not pertain to a specific people. Heidegger offers that, quote, the phrase a philosophy of a people immediately provokes an extremely ambiguous and obscure, immediately proves to be extremely ambiguous and obscure, because it gives the false impression that there exists, quote, an obvious way of philosophy's belongingness to the people, unquote. What Heidegger seems to be indicating is that philosophy, domestic philosophy, has the powerful effect of making a seemingly unquestionable link between philosophy and a people, a nation, or tribe. That domestic philosophy exists, has been articulated, and will continue to be, cannot be denied. But is domestic philosophy the natural habitat of thinking, of meaning-making, of dialogue? Here we must identify the contrast between domestic and a wandering philosophy. A thinking that emerges from the sojourn with being, which has no home, and cannot be reduced to a time, place, or people. Being emerges from or makes its appearance from a beyond, and draws us into this location when ebbing. The philosophy of wandering unfolds in the relationship with being, which does not reserve its tidings for humans. A domestic philosophy exists within a humanocentric abode, within a walled city, a concrete jungle. Within this domain, being is hardly present, and here we encounter the utter forgetfulness of the ultimate first questions. Here we encounter the homelessness that is, quote, the symptom of oblivion of being. Because of it, the truth of being remains unthought. Wonder is quelled, evocative speech drowned out by the juridical voice. A destruction of domestic philosophy and a tearing down of its walls is not necessarily the project of a wandering philosophy. Through the evocative speech, the intent, if there is one identifiable aim, is to encourage learning, to draw apprentices out from the confines of the domestic habitat, to get poetic dialogue underway. In drawing apprentices out from the walled city, we draw them into the world. Beyond the strict limits of a national philosophy is a world philosophy that arises from poetic dialogue when strangers who wander together in a strange land, a land none can claim to possess. When Heidegger says, quote, the world's destiny is heralded in poetry, he has identified the proper abode of a global philosophy. Such world philosophy is articulated from a language spoken by no one, and thus it is poetic. The poetic speech emerges from proper silence, from the dignified repose that signifies the true hearing of the autre. Quote, but who of us today would want to imagine that his attempts to think are at home on the path of silence? So that's it. That's an interesting ending for this particular meditation. So, ending yesterday by saying the sage's wandering cultivates a philosophy of the people takes me into today's meditation, and I drop into and make a distinction. I think it's an interesting one, if I do say so myself, but I think it's important because it really emphasizes the sense in which philosophy, for better or for worse, I'll say it, has a cosmopolitan sort of impulse behind it. So this is something I've been thinking about for many years. It goes all the way back to my dissertation, where I took up multiculturalism and suggested that, beyond fragmentation, and toward polyphony, which was the title of the dissertation. To move towards polyphony wasn't to eclipse or obscure or deny difference, but it was actually to sort of work with the desire to see that difference become more dynamic, right? So fragmentation is the state where folks are just remaining in their own sort of silos, be them the existential or cultural or what have you. But my assumption that we're all sort of in the state of becoming, in a process of becoming, and that being in that way, we need we ought to be constantly engaging with others to seize hold of that becoming. That isn't to say to control it, but to have an intentional way of relating to it, or making that process something that has intentionality, right? So that it is in dynamic relation with others, and so the process that we are becomes related to the process that others are, and then we sort of make this sort of dynamic, process together. That's what dialogue is. That's what philosophical dialogue is, and for me, that's just so much more interesting than something that we might call, identity politics, for example, which seems to be really, the desire to hold on to a particular space I have in this world, which is fine, but almost exclusive to wanting to engage with others. So that's what my dissertation was about. And so what this section is really getting at is the way in which that desire to stay within a particular space is really the desire for kind of safety, which, again, is the need for that. I mean, there's the safety from the elements, so to speak. There's the safety from what is Sartre calls the hell of other people. I mean, that's all well and good. But the point is that if we get caught in what I call the domesticity, so I split the word domesticity at the TI part so that it looks like domesticity, just to sort of emphasize this idea of it being like a city place. The domestic, the domos, the home. Insofar as we stay within that home space and we remain sort of safe in there, we're not taking full advantage, or we're not seizing the opportunity that's being made by the offering of being. In fact, I imagine I'll get into it in the upcoming writing, but here I'll just make the comment that it's not clear to me that when one remains inside the domestic space, enclosed in the safety of one's sort of identity, if you will, or one's sort of small community, if you will, that being's offering arrives there. I mean, does the offering of being spill into the domestic? If I was to be sort of classical or orthodox, so to speak, in my approach using the Greeks, they made these very strict sort of dividing lines between the private and the public sphere in the space of the domos, as opposed to the place of sort of the polis, the public sphere. And if I was to take that approach, then I would have to say no, it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, for example, I'm in my home right now and I'm recording these videos, and I think I'm trying at any rate to take up, to be in that philosophical modality where I'm, taking my own writing that was done 10 years ago and to keep it in play, to keep it alive. And so, it follows that one can be inside a space and still experience the dynamic. And also, I think that the unsettledness of the home life, the unsettledness and unpredictability of family life, that's exactly where being's presencing arises, because there's still the struggle for freedom, and there's still the desire for freedom, and maybe we feel it even more intensely actually in the home and in the family life. That's why there's oftentimes tempers flaring and tensions rising, because people feel that they don't have that space or they don't have that freedom. So, and again, that's why there's a distinction between the gathering of friends as opposed to the gathering of the family. And now I'm starting to sound very Hegelian right now, so far as I'm making distinctions between the state, the family, and what he calls the civil society. It's sort of side note would be to say that you just can't get away from from these tomes that you spend so much time in, and I spent a lot of time in Hegel, as I mentioned yesterday. So anyway, equality doesn't exist in the state and in the family life. So there's inequality built into the family life because of the relationship between parents and children, as well as the power relations between the sort of heads of the household, and then you have with the state as well. The state has an unequal relationship to the citizens and to the people because it has the power to enforce the law, right? So that that it always has within it the power of violence. Reserves the right, and it's only in times of revolution when that gets thrown up in the air. So that's really what a revolution is. Revolution is that time when the authority of the state is no longer secure. And it's interesting because you see this happening all the time, and they have different names for it, but it's always the same. It's when a head of state or a whole area of government, a parliament, a judicial branch, whatever the case may be, when there's no longer legitimacy, when there's more than a legitimation crisis, to use Heidegger's words, when there's an actual breakdown of the authority, where the people no longer recognize it, then there's like a revolution. For example, in the Ukraine a month ago, the head of state had to flee. That's a revolution, because his authority was no longer legitimate. So in the household and in the state, you have inequality, but in the civil society, you have equality, or at least that's what you're supposed to have. And so everyone is equal in that space, and everyone's supposed to treat one another as equal in that space. And out of that equality is what emerges community, right? And so it's in the civil society that you have community. It's in civil society that you have friendship, and all that sort of thing. It just gets really complicated and messy because of the marketplace. The marketplace is sort of pervasive, and it sort of like bleeds in and out. I guess it's what they call neoliberalism, where this the logic of the marketplace, consumption, buying and selling, that just bleeds into every one of the three spheres of it, and it creates all sorts of problems and issues. Let's just put it that way. So that to the point where, what is it? Habermas says it colonizes the life world. So philosophy then really is happening in the civil society. So and it happens outside of, if we want to say civil society as the gathering of cultural spaces, it happens even outside there. So it happens in a very unique space within the civil society or the public sphere. And that's where it's possible for us to engage in a gathering of sort of, I'm going to use the word pure, but equality in its most intense way, as well as plurality or singularity. So that's the dynamic. Now, how that's all resting on an ontological ground is, of course, what this book is all about. It's the attempt to go to the fundamental or primary ground that makes possible, or that we can reduce freedom and democracy to, right? So what makes freedom and democracy possible is the already givenness of being's presencing, that is to say, the excess or possibility. So the actual existence of possibility is another way of naming human freedom. Human freedom arises in that. And that comes to light, I'm arguing, or I'm suggesting, and I'm describing, through philosophy. And it's through a philosophy that is practiced in many different ways. It can be practiced through conversation and dialogue. It can be practiced through writing, which is what I did. It can be practiced through music and all the different sorts of arts as well, where the excess is taken up and human freedom articulates and makes something from that. So a bit of a roundabout commentary today, but that was kind of fun. I'll leave it at that.